Why, hello there, you. Before you get on and listen to this latest episode, I want to ask you a question. Do you have enough Myrtle Aid in your life? If the answer is no, did you know that you can get exclusive access to 2 whole previous seasons, dozens of exclusive episodes, and a catalogue of minisodes? All you have to do is head on over to patreon.com/myrtleaid, spelt MURDERLAIDE, and join our Patreon family. For as little as $5 a month, you get more Myrtle Aid than your strange mind can handle. The more you pledge, the more you get. Seriously, guys, that is like a single cup of coffee per month, and you help support me as a creator, and you help keep this podcast an ad-free zone. Because, there has to be one space in our lives that's ad-free. Okay, on with today's offering. Why, hello there, my dearest strange ones, and welcome to Myrtle Aid, the podcast. As always, I'm your host, Anne, and I write, record, and produce this podcast. Firstly, guys, fucking tax. Ugh. I'm officially a bit hating on this being an entrepreneur stuff. Like, when did this responsible adulting and sticking to a financial year become a fucking thing? I don't know if I'm sold on adulting yet. Let me just try it out for a few years and then I will give you an honest review. I have a big thank you and a giant shout out to Sarah Jane and Anne Harold, the newest members of our little Patreon family. Ladies, thanks so much for putting your money where my mouth is and for helping to support the podcast, which, by the way, guys, is what makes my podcast, unlike others, advert free. I mean, I could try and flog you some shitty mattresses or like a meal delivery system, but frankly, until I get to the point where I have to do that in order to keep this thing going, I don't wanna. If you would like access to the first 2 seasons of Myrtle Aid and a few dozen installments of serial episodes that dive deep into different Australian serial killers, or you would like to listen to the 20 or so microsodes that often bulge into macrosodes on the missing in Australia, or if you just have a tricky name and you want me to fuck up the pronunciation, yes, Aaron, I'm talking to you, bro, then head on over to patreon.com/myrtleaid and make your pledge. For as little as $5, you too can help keep this creation going and advert free. That's like 1 cup of coffee, right? Make your pledge and support me as a creator. This is a giant virtual hug, and thanks to all my patrons for contributing to keeping this rolling. I also want to say thank you to everyone who has reviewed the podcast. Like, I've had lots of reviews lately and they've all been really lovely. It's starting to gain momentum in some really strange hotspots, like Jordan. If you're listening to me from my little country homestead in South Australia all the way in fucking Jordan, that is blowing my mind right now. So hey, Jordan, what's up? We also hit a huge milestone this week, guys. The podcast has 200,000 downloads. I shit you not. I had to double check my numbers. 200,000. Fucking proud and humbled, strange ones. Most podcasts, actually, I did my research because I like to do that. Most podcasts only last between 3 and 7 months with a total of 5 hours content. And we've smashed that shit. So congratulations to all of us for sticking it out for this long. Me for writing it, you for doing your part in listening, and for spreading the word. This podcast contains graphic depictions of violence, salty language, and poor grammar. This episode also contains acts of supposed terrorism that may cause people distress. It may also really trigger some people in that we're going to be discussing events in the Middle East and recent wars and a really recent and tragic episode of Australia's history. So I don't want to hear about it that you were triggered by me and I didn't trigger warn you, because this is becoming a theme. Me saying this podcast contains graphic depictions of violence, this is your trigger warning, all right? Before we kick off today, I want to say if you're new to me and new to the podcast, I am not a reporter. I'm not a political respondent or an employee of the government or of anyone. Actually, I am an independent artist with a morbid fascination for death and the darker side of history. Today, I'm going to be talking about matters of national security, immigration, and religion. I am not talking about these things as an expert. I am an armchair detective, if you catch my drift. I am not an expert on any of this shit, so if I get a little muddled, please allow me the leeway to do so. If you think you are an expert on these things, well, fuck. Feel free to go off and make yourself your own damn podcast, because I'll be turning my notifications off. I do not want to hear your fucking opinion. Bear that in mind. You are going to be pissed. You're allowed to be. I am pissed after researching this, but this podcast is not about laying blame. We are not an inquest, right? Remember that everyone has rights, and we are a country that proudly gives you the benefit of the doubt, except for taxes. You're always wrong with taxes. Like I said, if you wish for your opinion to be heard, feel free to write, record, and produce your own podcast at your own peril. Get it? Awesome. If you're still here, then you're all in. So today we are going to talk about the local Australian event that occurred in Sydney and is just widely known as the Lindt Cafe siege. As with the Port Arthur massacre, this event is one that redefined us here as Australians in our thoughts, and it challenged and changed some of our laws and really challenged the way we view ourselves. We have always been the lucky country. We think of ourselves as fair but smart. We like to think of our government and our authorities as super fucking smart and always looking at the big issues with intelligence and foresight. But the reality is most of the people working in small parts of our government are just really bureaucracy and pencil pushers, and they're just normal people. This event proved that we were all naive and wrong. The events leading up to and during this act of violence showed clearly that our mistakes were made all the way down the line. From the moment he entered Australia, the perpetrator, known as Manhurin Manus, posed serious fucking safety risks. And lots of people knew it, but we didn't have the policy or the leaders to deal with it at the time. This is the first time I personally ever heard the term an act of domestic terrorism. Actually, I've never heard of any terrorism, for that matter, on Australian soil. We kind of always think about terrorism as happening to others here. We're very isolated from it, and it's like it's happening out there in the world. This stuff happens in America, in England, in the Middle East. That was our mindset. This event brought that delusion that we were all under and all sharing to an end. We're all left wondering, how could this have happened here? How did no one see that this was probable and not put a stop to it? Which is very easy in hindsight, because when you sift through the wreckage of the information that we now have, there was really not only a massive amount of warning signs, but on paper this event was totally preventable. But like all things morbid and depressing, it was super fucking complicated. And so is Manus, to be honest. He was a delusional man with a high need for recognition, attention, and revenge. But was this actually terrorism, as we have been sold? Was this a mismanagement of immigration and mental health? Sources for today's episode are the ABC program Four Corners in their two-part special simply titled The Siege, from SBS News website How the Siege Unfolded, From The Guardian, Sydney cafe siege, a timeline of events. An article from Claire Bloomer at the ABC News titled Man Monis's girlfriend, Amira Drudas sentenced to 44 years jail. An article from The Australian by Natasha Beta from the 17th of December 2014, deranged Monis granted citizenship in 2004. Arash Azi wrote an article for Monoto One called Exclusive. The Sydney hostage taker had fled Iran after a $200,000 fraud case. From the Aussie Leader, siege gunman dropped off watch list. The Yahoo News on the 16th of December 2014 by Paul Biddy, Lint Cafe siege gunman once had luxurious life in Tehran funded by a scam involving Iranian government. From the Sydney Morning Herald again, by Tim Elliott, an article called Martin Place Gunman Deranged, Deluded and Dangerous. And then Sydney siege, man behind the Martin Place standoff was Iranian Manharon Monis, who had a violent criminal history. That was by Laura Knowles for the ABC News. At 8:30 a.m. on the morning of Monday, the 15th of December 2014, just 10 days before Christmas, CCTV footage shows a business day running up to a peak of shopping season in the district of Sydney's Martin Place. It's already a pretty crowded hustle. An adult man of average height can be seen strolling through the middle of this footage. He's amongst foot traffic. He's wearing a possibly tan-coloured baseball cap, a blue hoodie, full-length tan pants, and he's carrying a really loaded dark backpack that is slung over one shoulder. He casually but purposefully walks across the frame. This is the moment that he's been waiting for. He's been aching for, but the city around him lies completely unaware of what is about to unfold. So the figure in this footage is now calling himself Manharon Monis, and he is about to change all that we knew in the world, and not for the better. Manharon is an Iranian-born man who came to Australia on a working visa via Malaysia, and when it expired, he engineered to stay as a refugee. This man is a con artist. He's a wanted felon in his country of birth. He's a known accessory to murder in this one. At the time that the footage is captured, he was allegedly wanted for prosecution by Interpol. He is hated by many here and across the seas. He is a serious, repeated sex offender. He's a convicted harasser of families of the soldiers killed in action and is actually banned from using the postal system. He is a known on all levels of law enforcement here in Australia and overseas. And just 48 hours before he is seen in this footage, Manharon Monis had been reported to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, known as ASIO, because someone thought that his views that he was posting on his website against Australians and the government was dangerous and extreme. He was deemed not to be a threat, and no further action was taken. By the moment he is seen crossing between the heritage-fronted buildings on Martin Place through the morning rush, Manharon Monis is an Australian citizen. He is faking that he is a member of the Islamic clergy, and he has been diagnosed with many mental illnesses and is suspected of having schizophrenia. Oh yeah, he also claims to be a black magic healer, but he can only heal a woman if he sexually assaults her first. He is a former security guard and he has a gun license. Monis is at that very moment out on bail facing 40 serious charges, including accessory to murder. He has recently received 400 hours of community service for a federal conviction. He was 3 days out from having his appeal of this conviction having been thrown out of court. He would have to carry that guilty verdict and do the community service. In the months leading up to this moment, Monis has played pretend as an adult and actually dressed up in the traditional outfit of a Muslim cleric and chained himself to a pole out the front of the Channel 7 News building in Martin Place, the spot he was headed for now. He had harassed Channel 7 newsreaders and reporters as they made their way in and out of their workplace. He is a delusional man and he sees enemies in the faces of all who pass him in the street, even other Muslims. He completely forsook his faith in the week before this event and converted to a new one that suited his more current thoughts of aggression, and in his mind, that faith he had practiced his whole life was just given up for something else. He didn't give a fuck how his actions affect others. He only ever sees himself as an important and central character in his modern life. He delusionally thinks that he is having an impact on international politics. Delusions of grandeur that know no bounds. The Lindt Cafe he saunters into moments later is located at 53 Martin Place. It's on the ground floor of the APA building, right in the heart of Sydney's busy business district. It is the perfect spot for a premium chocolatier to set up a walk-in cafe. So Lindt is positioned directly across from the 7 News television studios. It's right near the Reserve Bank of Australia, the headquarters of the Commonwealth Bank and the Westpac Bank, and right across from the Martin Place Underground train station. For those of you who care, it's also pretty close to Tiffany. This cafe was frequented by mostly people who work in the area. When Monis enters, he sits down at a table and he has all appearances of being a typical morning rush customer. He's actually a walking nightmare for anyone he came into contact with throughout his adult life. And this time, it was going to be no different. I would say just ask his ex-wife, but he had recently tasked someone else whose life he had shat all over with the task of killing her, so we can't. Lindt Cafe employee Harriet Denny was waved over by Monis, and he asked her politely to see her manager. He had a smile on his face, and she just figured he wanted to make a complaint. So Harriet fetches her manager, 34-year-old Tory Johnson, a tall, smiling blonde man who makes his way over to the table, and everything is about to change. The morning rush, the Christmas shopping. Even me, who is about to plonk myself down on the couch with a coffee after dropping my kids off at school, we are all about to witness Monis's crazy last stand. Tory Johnson seems like he was a stand-up guy, a good manager. Friends and family say he loved and respected his staff, and by all appearances, they loved and respected him too. He was in a loving 16-year relationship. His parents adored him. His boyfriend adored him. He had a life, hopes, dreams, and a future. When Tory sat down at the table with Monis, he was a guy with a world at his feet, a ready smile for anyone. He was charismatic and charming. He spoke with Monis quietly for a few moments. What exactly was said we'll probably never know, but Tory then called over 19-year-old waiter Jared Morton Hoffman. Jared says that Tory looks afraid. Tory tells him to lock all of the doors to the cafe. And in that moment, there were now 10 customers and 8 staff trapped inside the Lindt Cafe with the armed and dangerous psychopath. The siege that changed Australia had begun. In his possession, Monis had a 50-year-old sawn-off French-made shotgun, a pump action called Manu France Lecelle, and it was imported into Australia in the 1950s. It wasn't ever registered. No one knows how it came to be in Monis's possession. He had 23 shotgun cartridges of different brands on him, and they were all between 15 and 20 years old. In his backpack, it was suspected he had a bomb, but he also had a black flag with Islamic writing on it. Monis thought that this was the ISIS flag, but it wasn't, because Monis was not acting for ISIS. He was acting alone. He was never a member of ISIS, as he would have us all believe. Monis had no one to claim him, and he has no one to claim. But who is this man sitting, smiling across from Tory Johnson that morning? Well, to answer that, we have to go back across the oceans and across time to when the name Man Horan Monis was not even yet a figment of his own imagination, because Man Horan Monis was actually someone he made up, a part of his fantastical life that he brought to reality. Now, some are apt to call this man fanatical, but I don't think that's right. He is not a fanatical Muslim. He's a fantastical narcissist. He has no more commitment to Islam than he does to the many disposable women in his life. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a fanatic as a person whose strong admiration for something is extreme and unreasonable. The only thing man Hieronymus has a strong admiration for was himself. He is not promoting his faith and his devotion. He's not trying to get some kind of outcome that would be good for Islam. He wasn't there for a cause as much as he was for the most of the press releases that would have us believe. No, he only wants good outcomes for himself. This kind of crazy can be especially easy to predict most of the time. Although their behavior may be unreasonable, they will always do what is best for them, regardless of how it affects others. Manharan's sole purpose seems to have been that he must be recognized, seen, that his inflated sense of injustice needed to be validated. He needed to feel important, not just to those in his life. He wants to be famous, and he wants that fame to be attached to an ideology. He didn't care what ideology it was. He just wanted attention that brought him a sense of self-inflation. Man Hieronymus's main complaint with the world was that he was fucking special. So special, in fact, that he did not have to live a life by the same rules as the rest of society. Not here, not in his country of birth, not anywhere. He was such a special goddamn snowflake, and he was about as robust as a snowflake too. His fragile ego couldn't take anything. So we're going to leave the siege as it begins until next time, because this tale of woe really doesn't begin there, does it? This story is how it came to be the Lindt Cafe siege, and it really begins in Iran. On the 19th of May 1964, baby Mohammed Hassan Mentkeri Bujadi is born in the city of Burjad. Yeah, I know, real imaginative, but it's traditional there to take the last name of your birthplace. Get it? So it's in this crowded capital city in the Loristan province in western Iran that this person comes to being. Again, I'm just going to apologize straight out to my most patient Arabic friend, who is the most beautiful woman and has tried to work with me on my pronunciation. Babe, I love you and I still suck at this. Perhaps one day I will take Arabic and Persian lessons, maybe. So I want to talk to you about Burjad. This city is old, like fucking biblical old, having sat in the same location, as far as we know, since at least the 3rd century, like thousands of years old, right? So throughout recent history, like much of Iran, Burjad has been war-torn and had several despotic leaders, has inbuilt systems of corruption at all levels of government, and the infrastructure is pretty shabby. The citizens of Iran from about 1970s have had this battle against corruption at every level of government, and that's just to meet their daily needs of living. Although not as corrupt as some of its near neighbours, by the 80s, life in Iran had become exceedingly difficult by Western standards. So someone like Mohammed Bojurdi, that was such terrible pronunciation. This is just what he needs to rip people off, is these like fractured forms of government and these really corrupt tiers, which he sort of played off and used. But he didn't start like that. In 1996, Bojurdi published his first book of poetry titled Inside and Out, and it didn't receive the accolades he was hoping for. In fact, it barely sold and it was slammed by critics. Do you want to hear some of his poetry? Well, I'm going to give you a slice and you can decide for yourself. So, quote, "They swapped injustice and justice with one another. Words did never keep their meaningfulness. Yes in place of no, and no in place of yes. The truth is void of truth. You said that here the talk is about inferiors. Inferiority here is for free, as much as you need." Here you should only be looking for treachery. Even if you are a nightingale, remain in the cloth of vultures. You said that the pigeons go with pigeons and the falcons with falcons. I have never seen such a pair flying together. So, I don't know about you, but I think maybe the critics got it right. I am not a literary genius here, but maybe it sounds better in its original Persian. My question is, what the fuck does that even mean? That is kind of the most trite, meaningless piece of meaningless crap I've ever seen paper wasted on, in my opinion. To me, that poem has all the hallmarks of someone who wants to sound worldly and wise, but it just comes off really wordy, right? Am I wrong here? Is there something I'm missing? But whatever in my opinion, it doesn't count because anyway, that great steaming pile of horseshit is apparently the reason that Amnesty International supported Mohammed Bourdieu's bid to be granted asylum in Australia. But I get ahead of myself. That's a different name and a different time. In the early 90s, when he was known as Mohammed, he was involved in a government-sanctioned scam where he bought and sometimes stole second-hand tyres from government vehicles and then sold them on Iran's bustling black market. Sometimes he ripped off those tyres from the same fucking government and then sold them back to the government. There was like scams within this scam, but I don't want to digress too much here. Let's just summarize and say that this guy is not a good guy, but he's really good at making money from chaos, and his country finds itself in complete chaos. Particularly during the Gulf War, Iran is completely torn apart and all systems of government are kind of reshuffled. But Bourdieu is not afraid to double-cross, and he has no respect for authority. He thinks himself a pretty smart man. So the main source of income for the Bourdieu family is his big business, a travel agency. So this was got to be completely money laundering, right? And a front for his other rip-off scams, one of which is a charity scam so that he never has to pay taxes. You know, taxes to that government that he's ripping off blind with his tyre scams. And we are all meant to believe that in the 90s, in the midst of the Gulf War, Iranian tourism is big fucking business. I just simply don't believe that. It was using this pretext of his business that Bourdieu gained a working visa into Australia. But he came via Malaysia, the way that other successful rip-off merchants have really gained access here. So in here he comes, to the lucky country. And he is full of all his plans and schemes and his complete disregard for the system. He has these big plans to make more money, to be an important man. In fact, he had used the system so well to this point. He was a reasonably wealthy guy. By Iran's standards, he was also married and he had 2 daughters. See, in all of the government reshuffling and changes, the dust settled and his scams were exposed. At the time he fled Iran, he was wanted for ripping off the local government and for ripping $200,000 off of locals through the tourist business. And they were out for blood. When he left Iran, this asshole left his wife and kids behind, knowing he was never going back for them. And he left them with nothing but a corrupt government debt and hundreds of thousands of dollars with people wanting it. There was a warrant out for his arrest, and allegedly he was also beginning to be investigated by Interpol. So he's a stand-up guy. Let's let him into our country, right? This piece of shit probably is responsible for the harsh judgment of thousands of legitimate refugees who are fleeing persecution, not fleeing the legal system as he was, not being allowed into Australia after him. Anyway, I digress. So then Bourdieu decides to deliberately outstay his visa. You know how I know that? Because moments before his visa ran out, he applied for a bridging visa. and he applied for a protection visa. So for those of you who are interested, the majority of people who are illegally residing in Australia do not come here in leaky boats and rafts as our government would have you believe. The vast majority, up to 90% some years, are people who come here legally on planes and then just don't leave when they're supposed to. This is exactly what Buzzsprout8817970 did. He overstayed his working visa, which was only for a month, and then he applied for this protection visa. Our government granted him a bridging visa while he waited to see the outcome of this application. Like, this fucker is good at using paperwork against bureaucrats. He has bureaucracy in his blood, right? And I don't want you to think that he's sitting behind a chain link fence out in the desert begging to be allowed in. Oh no, this fucker is sitting in a share apartment in Sydney, rented by our own government on his behalf while all this paper shuffling is going down, because he is claiming that he is a persecuted political refugee. And how the fuck is one meant to nail that down? If he is a persecuted person, like, is he running from persecution or prosecution? There's a distinct difference. If you check with the country he's claiming to be running from and they tell you the truth, or are they going to tell you what you want to hear to try and get him back so they can prosecute or persecute him some more? It's like catch-22 for Australian government officials. Can they believe the Iranian government, or do they believe the man standing in front of them? And it's not like we're talking about high-end politicians with massive careers and huge amounts of money into their education behind them, or even people who are adept at reading other people and, these are not psychologists and stuff. We're talking about regular Joe Blows who are working in immigration. They're trying to understand and liaise with all of these foreigners, all of these countries, and shit tons of different personal and political circumstances. They are dealing with super heavy lots, and they are dealing with a super adapted liar here. This man's views of himself is that he's so important. I think that it would be really hard for just your average bureaucrat to get past his bravado. In this process, Buzzsprout8817970 is now calling himself Ayatollah Buzzsprout8817970, claiming that he was working for Iranian intelligence for the military during the 1990 start of the Gulf War. Injecting himself into these political circumstances is going to be a hallmark of Buzzsprout8817970's future behaviour. He claimed to the Australian government that his wife and children were being held in detention in Iran because his liberal views on Islam were not accepted and that he would be killed if he returned to Iran. And because of the information that he held about Iran's Gulf War efforts. So now he's seeking political asylum. For those of us, me included, this name change seems insignificant, right? He's gone from Muhammad to Ayatollah. But in fact, this name change says everything. Ayatollah is not really a name one can just give oneself. Ayatollah is a noun. It is a title given to high-ranking, respected religious leaders among the Shiite Muslims. This is a title of respect that is given to you, not one you bestow upon yourself, as this snowflake did. To be Ayatollah is an honour, one he spits on because he changed his name to this. It's something that is only achieved by scholars who have demonstrated highly advanced knowledge of Islamic law. We have no evidence that Buzzsprout8817970 ever did this. So now you think that when it comes to the government, they would begin to try and communicate and untangle this man's web of bullshit, but it seems that he knew how to play both sides of the fence pretty effectively. The official word from Iran is that they allegedly informed the Australian government that Buzzsprout8817970 was a wanted man for fraud and violent crime. He had defrauded his government and ripped off citizens in a travel agency. It seems he was offering some kind of scam where he suggested he could smuggle people out of Iran and into countries like the US and Australia. But he just took these people's money and probably booked it to Australia, one last big scam before he got out, right? And in the process, leaving his wife, who is on the registration paperwork for all of his business, like holding the baby, so to speak, and actually holding his 2 babies. He didn't apply to get them out here just yet, by the way. He just didn't want to go back. This information package contained a warrant for Bourjeudi's arrest in Iran and the start of the investigation by Interpol. Australia has no extradition treaty with Iran. The request by his native country to hand him over was apparently ignored by ours. So allegedly the Australian government had this information even if they lost it or it wasn't received at the time. And in 1997, 1 year after his arrival in Australia, Bourjeudi received his protection visa. He applied for and was given a gun license and a security guard license, which he held until the year 2000. He was legally carrying a gun on the streets. Lucky for us, Bourjeudi is an arsehole and he couldn't hold a job for long, so he was only working in there for short stints of time. In the meantime, Iran is working to provide Australian authorities more evidence that Bourjeudi is actually the man that they're thinking of giving asylum to, that he's the same criminal they are after. There's like a trail of identification documents that took 4 years for the Iranian government to sort out. That's how fucked this guy is. And of course, with all psychos, there's multiple name changes. Australia's response was that he was protected from extradition by his refugee status. He would not have to pay for any of his fraud crimes in Iran, as long as he stayed here. So Bourjeudi was beginning to paint himself into a bit of a corner. He was protected while he was here, but if he went back home, he would face criminal charges and probably end up in all kinds of shit. And I can imagine people kind of hated this guy, so someone would have beaten him to death in the street, really. So if he chose not to, he chose not to go back. He chose not to face the music. And then he chose to start blaming Australia and the Australian government for those choices that he made, like that textbook blame deferring, right? He starts making applications straight away to try and get his wife and daughters over here from Iran. Now, it's been 4 years since he's seen his family. And he didn't try anywhere near as hard to get his family out as he did for himself, in all honesty. So with bravado as big as his ego, in the year 2000, Bourjeudi dresses himself in the traditional clothing of a Muslim cleric and literally camped out at Parliament House, like in a tent. He claims that government officials are to blame for him not being able to see his wife and children for 4 years. This guy is offensive on all levels. He's running this media circus under his new assumed name, which is Ayatollah Mengerti Bourjeudi, and he is now claiming to be a leader in Islam, basically the equivalent to a priest. By the way, he has no qualification to claim that, nor does he have any training other than being raised as a Muslim. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert here, but some of these things seem to be pretty important. There are different branches of Islam, and they are prevalent all over the Middle East and all over the world, but there seems to be 2 main branches, being Shia and Sunni. Both follow the teachings of Allah, and both have many similar basic doctrines, but there are fundamental differences in the way that each side interprets the Quran. Throughout much of history, these branches have lived both peacefully alongside each other, even like in worship with each other, and then juxtaposingly in never-ending war with each other. I'm not going to take sides because I am not qualified or educated enough to, but it seems to depend on who is at the higher leadership end of both parties as to the level of animosity that one side takes against the other. We kind of compare it here to different paths of Christianity, but that seems to be really understating the fundamental differences in how this faith runs. So our dickhead we are discussing here seems to have been raised a Shia. Most of his life in Australia, he participated in the Shia fundamentals of his faith. Only his fellow Shia in Sydney also thought of him as, quote, strange, creepy, and off-putting. Claiming to be a cleric is like the height of disrespect to a faith. That's like me saying, oh, fuck, I went to private school, donning a habit, and now I'm a nun, and you all have to respect me and take my word as being part of the Catholic Church. It doesn't work that way, right? But at this stage, the man now calling himself Ayatollah Burzrudi is setting up a tent at Parliament House, and he eventually chains himself to a pole for publicity. He's like offending fucking everyone. He camped out for a week, but he only stayed chained up for exactly one day, long enough to get his ugly head on every station's news coverage for that day and to highlight what he drummed up to be injustice of his family separation. Deep down, you have to think he just wanted to get his fat head on TV. This guy isn't garnering support for a family reunion. He was after like the respect of being a cleric, even if he's only pretending, and he wants to be part of the political landscape at the time, which is really tumultuous. It's really boiling. And he wants to feel important, not like the loser he's totally becoming. Because, once upon a time, let's remember, this man was important. He was ripping off the government. He had like hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had lots of employees. He's spoiling his wife and children. And then he moves here. And he is totally forestalled by our bureaucracy and our governmental processes. He has a lot of he has to work hard for money to start off with. He can't just go in and rip off tires and sell them back to the government. That doesn't wash in Australia. And he ends up quite a large percentage of the time that he is here on government benefits. So he's pissed at the government, but relying on the government at the same time. And he must be totally fucking gutted when we didn't allow his wife and children in, because he just unchained himself and walked away, quietly hooking up with another woman that he'd been dating anyway, actually marrying her. And 12 months later, our nation decides that we should offer him permanent residency. Yay for us, right? Now, I don't want you to give the impression that I'm in any way anti-immigration. I am a woman of white privilege. So I'm the descendant of immigrants, yeah? My ancestry is not running from war, but from the Great Potato Famine. We came here on a leaky boat, escaping starvation. Same, only different, right? I also don't support locking families away behind razor wire fences because they come from a place we don't understand yet. I do, in fact, have several beautiful friends who were born in the Middle East and live here now. One of them who tried really hard to coach me on my pronunciation of this episode. Sorry, babe, I was such a fucking Aussie when I came to record this episode. I forgot everything you told me. I believe immigration has founded this nation. And if I had my way, it would be a huge part of its future. However, our system is so flawed. I also believe that we should be screening people who come here. And that includes really radicalized Austrian people, American people, Finnish folks, and Muslims. We collectively have bought into the politic of someone else, and we've bought this anti-Muslim agenda. It's playing out in awful ways in our community. Remember, not so long ago, Catholics and Protestants were at each other. There were bombings and assassinations happening all over the UK, but somehow that didn't make us anti-Christian, did it? Also, don't believe that just because you can afford to fly here and overstay your visa, that you should have any more right to stay here than those who came on a boat. You all broke the law just as equally, and we should treat you the same, right? Every person has the burden to prove that they are going to be a participant in what Australia is now and what they're going to participate in its future. That burden lies with those who seek asylum, not with us. This fucktard is a proven liar, and we let him in anyway. He was being investigated for ripping people off somewhere else, and we gave him amnesty. We invited this mentally deranged and ill man to eventually become a citizen. What I do believe in this case is a great deal of giant-sized, like house-sized red flags, that this creepy, unstable, and often illegal behaviour of one man who's claiming to be escaping political prejudice, But he's come here and he's slamming the politics of our country too. That we rewarded him with our attention and national coverage of his self-indulgent schemes to bolster himself up and make him feel super important. Buzzsprout8817970 is claiming that Iran is defective and corrupt country who are out to get him. But then he's also recorded trying to bribe ASIO officials with information for money. He's just a clear fucking hustler. Some people are just bad, right? This man lied to get here, and he obviously lied to stay. If our system was working in any way, these red flags should have been popping up everywhere, and he should have been removed and investigated. So after the incident at Parliament House where he threatens politicians and verbally accosts and attacks reporters in this thinly veiled attention-seeking act, we invited him to stay. The country he was claiming to hate while living here on our tax-paid benefits, by the way, we officially welcomed him. And that seems a little fucked up. That's where I'm going to leave it for today, folks. Remember to sleep with one eye open and call the cops on all your dodgy neighbours. But not just because they're different, y'all. They have to actually be scary, okay? See you next time. Hello again, it's me, Anne. Can I ask you a favour? If you liked this episode of Murderlade or any previous episodes, please take a moment to rate and review if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, or alternately, head on over to Facebook and rate the show at the Murderlade the Podcast page. Every rate and review helps other strange ones find us and join the family. Oh yeah, and I totally mean that in a creepy Manson family or the Aussie cult, the family kind of way. Thanks for listening.